I'm Tim Exile and I'm going to explain how to route multi-channel MIDI from a plugin to your DAW. I'm going to explain this in the context of Scapeshift, which is a generative groovebox that I launched just over a month ago. But the same principles apply to anything that generates MIDI on multiple channels. Scapeshift is available on my Patreon store. It's built in Native Instruments Reactor and requires a full license of that to be able to run it without limitations. Adventurer backers get a 50% discount, and all the links for that are down in the description. A couple of weeks ago, I pushed out Scapeshift 1.1. The headline feature was MIDI out that would allow you to use Scapeshift's multiple generative engines to trigger external sources like hardware or plugins using multi-channel MIDI output. So while I was building it, I tried to set it up in Ableton, but I couldn't. And I assumed this was just because I'm not an Ableton guy. So I set it up in a digital modular that I've used quite a lot called groovebox, and it worked fine. But when I released it, I got a ton of messages from people who just couldn't get it to work in Ableton. So it turns out that Ableton, and in fact most DAWs today, flatten the MIDI output of plugins to MIDI channel 1. And this makes it basically impossible to route more than one channel of Scapeshift's output just using the features of your DAW. I've started digging into why this design decision has been made by so many DAW developers, and it's opening up some fascinating wormholes that kind of cut to the core of the history of how DAWs have evolved over time. I'm going to make a video about that at some point, but for now, here's how to get around this limitation. There are three main approaches, each with their own trade-offs, each with their own benefits. If you mainly want to use Scapeshift to trigger plugins inside your DAW, you need to use a wrapper plugin that can host plugins itself and output to a virtual MIDI port. If triggering plugins in your DAW is less important, you can use a digital modular like groovebox that can host VSTs, and there's an added benefit to that which I'll talk about in a bit. If you're mostly triggering hardware, to be honest, you're much better off using Reactor in standalone mode. To use Scapeshift to trigger plugins in a DAW, you need to host Reactor in a third-party digital modular plugin which can itself host plugins and output MIDI directly to your system's MIDI ports. Then you need to route that MIDI back into the host's MIDI ports using a virtual MIDI port. Examples of digital modulars you can use for this are Cushview Element or groovebox, although other solutions may be available depending on your DAW or platform. Element can be used for free, while Bidule retails for $95. Both are compatible with Windows and Mac OS, and I put download links to them in the description. If you're on Windows, you need to download and install a third-party app to create a virtual MIDI port. The most common one is Loop MIDI, which I've linked in the description. If you're on Mac OS, open Audio MIDI Setup, go to MIDI Studio, double-click on the IAC driver, and make sure Device is Online is checked. Now open up your DAW, drop the Element or Bidule plugins on a new channel, load up Reactor as a plugin, and add the output of your virtual MIDI port as a device. Hook up Reactor's audio outputs to Bidule or Element's audio output. Then wire up Reactor's MIDI outputs to the virtual MIDI port. Inside Reactor, open Scapeshift and set any or all of the engines into MIDI mode and set their channels. Make sure the virtual MIDI port is enabled in your DAW. You should now be receiving multi-channel MIDI into your DAW, which you can then map using the DAW's MIDI functions. The trade-off with this method is that, as far as I know, none of the DAWs actually allow you to route back multi-channel audio back into a plugin, so you won't be able to route your plugins back into Reactor to mix using Scapeshift's mix engine. But the benefit is that, of course, you can use all the multi-channel recording capabilities of your DAW. The process to setting up Scapeshift in a digital modular outside of DAW is pretty much the same, but instead of hosting Element or Visual as plugins in a DAW, you launch them as standalone apps. And there's a huge benefit to doing this because this way you get to use Scapeshift's mix engine for all the plugins you host. I tried this process using both the free Element and paid Visual, and really unfortunately I just couldn't get Element to load anything in Reactor without crashing. This is such a shame because honestly, running Scapeshift in a standalone digital modular is by far the best way to unleash its full potential, and I really wanted to offer you a way of doing it at no extra cost, but it just didn't work out. So I'm going to show you how to do this in Visual. And I've actually made a Visual template for this, which has done a lot of the hard work that I'm about to describe, and the download link for that is in the description. Open Visual, right click and insert the Reactor 6 FX VST3 plugin. You need to use the effects version as the instrument version doesn't support multiple inputs. The blue terminals are audio ports, the white terminals are MIDI ports. Connect the first two left-hand audio output ports in Reactor to the first two left-hand ports on the sound card output device. Open Scapeshift inside the Reactor plugin. Set it playing back a pattern that uses most or all of the engines. Now go through each engine and set them to MIDI mode. Leave Scapeshift playing back even though you can't hear anything. Now I'm going to set up a plugin to replace the drum sound engine. Go back to the main Visual view, right click and choose MIDI Splitter to insert the MIDI splitter object. Attach its output port to Reactor's MIDI output port. Now insert your plugin of choice. Hook up the left output of the MIDI channel splitter to your plugin's white MIDI input terminal. Now hook up your plugin's first two audio outputs to the first two input channels of Reactor 6 effects. You should now be hearing sound from your chosen plugin passed through Scapeshift's mix and effects engine and sent to the audio outputs of your sound card. Repeat the same process to add further plugins triggered by other engines. Scapeshift's audio inputs are mapped as follows: drums on stereo pair 1, bass on stereo pair 2, lead on stereo pair 3, polysynth on stereo pair 4, and noise on stereo pair 6. If you're using a mix of Scapeshift engines and plugins, use the offset control to set up the correct latency compensation so that everything is perfectly in sync. And if you're luckier than me and you can actually get Cushview Element to work, the process will be very similar. If you want to use Scapeshift to trigger hardware, then I definitely recommend using Reactor in just plain standalone mode. Launch the Reactor app, go to File, Audio and MIDI Settings, set up your sound card in the Audio tab. In the Routing tab, you can define which of Reactor's inputs and outputs are routed to which sound card inputs and outputs. In the MIDI tab, you can enable the MIDI ports you want to send the MIDI that Reactor generates to. Open Scapeshift and enable MIDI mode for any or all of the engines. You can then use your own MIDI and audio routing strategy to send MIDI to your hardware devices and route their audio output back into Reactor. Okay, that's it. I hope this has been useful. If it has, please do like, please do subscribe. Scapeshift is available in my Patreon store, which is linked below, and my adventurer backers, of course, get a 50% discount. There's lots more videos and lots more software coming soon, so stay tuned, and thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.